Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And it's a pleasure to be up here with John and Joe and even Diane. So I want to quickly, no, I'm serious. Diane is a huge person here, not only in Birmingham, but in the country. You know, in my field, a lot of folks ask and banter and debate whether or not whites can write about stories or history of African Americans. And, you know, the answer to that question, or at least in my view, in my opinion, is, you know, it's not black history. It is not white history. It is American history. It is our history. And so I was very pleased, I think everyone was, when this book came out, that Diane wrote. As you know, Diane is a Southern native raised here in Birmingham, Alabama, and was educated at Wellesley College, graduating magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts degree in comparative literature. She lives with her family in New York City, where she co-founded a volunteer program serving foster children in the Bronx. Now, this underscores kind of what I was getting at. In 2001, when her book, Carry Me Home, was released, the New York Times, of course, did a book review. And David Shipler, who wrote this book review, and I just want to read this first part. I think it really tells you the gravity of this book and the perspective that Diane brings. There are few white people in America more passionately perceptive about our vexing national problem of race than liberal-minded whites from the South, especially those who lived through the turbulent years of the Civil Rights Movement. And Diane, without further ado, I ask you to come to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. I'd like to join your group after hearing about all the social events. Maybe the relevant thing to tell you is that when I spoke here to Rotary a few weeks ago, I was introduced as the former president of TKD sorority. So, and then when I was in Italy hanging out with a bunch of intellectuals last fall, somebody asked me, why do you act like a sorority girl? And I said, because I am a sorority girl. And Joe, I wanted to tell you that as of 5 years ago, I could still get up on one ski, that is. That's the sort of badge of the lake culture around here. You can get up on one. Well, I've begun to realize that probably the smartest thing I ever did in life was to come from Alabama. Back when Carry Me Home came out, a male journalist friend of mine, and journalists are the most competitive tribe on earth, kind of read the preface to my book and sort of said appraisingly, half with envy, half with respect, you did a pretty good job of making Birmingham seem like the center of the universe. Well, I've got news for him. I found a new center of the universe in Alabama, Huntsville. The subject of my next book turns out to have been at the center of the international crisis of the 20th century, the Cold War, much as Birmingham was at the center of the domestic crisis, the Civil Rights Movement. My new book that I've been down here for almost 3 months now working on, starts here on the moon at Tranquility Base, and then jumps back to the man who got us there, Wernher von Braun. Have you guys heard of him, Wernher von Braun? Okay, you will later, but this is sort of a generational thing. If you grew up here, you had to have heard of him in the 60s, as I did. Anyway, he had been the young genius in charge of Hitler's top-secret missile program during the war. And though the V-2 rocket, which he built, which was the first ballistic missile and the first rocket to pierce the rim of outer space, did not prove to be the wonder weapon that Hitler was banking on to take over the world, because it was such an important breakthrough technologically and militarily. Von Braun was obviously a very coveted war trophy. And in 1945, after tussling with our then allies, the Soviets, over who would get these intellectual spoils of war, we got von Braun and about 120 technicians, engineers, scientists who had worked with him at Peenemünde, which had been the top secret missile military installation on the Baltic coast where they had worked, where they had built the V2. Here they are coming over. Look at the guy in the yellow sweater over there, kind of in the front row, because he's going to come up later. In 1950, after languishing a few years in an army camp in Texas, the Von Braun team was relocated to Huntsville. And presto, the town once known as the watercress capital of the world became Rocket City, USA, for it was here that the German rocketeers built the engineering marvel of the century, the Saturn V rocket that put the Apollo 11 astronauts on the moon a giant leap ahead of the Soviets. Now, the Huntsville story just has it all. In addition to the moon landing, we have the Third Reich, we have World War II, we have the Cold War, West and East German intrigue, and finally, the angle that gave me the courage to stake my claim on the subject. The building of the Saturn V rocket took place at the time of George Wallace, which in the 60s, the Civil Rights era, which is, of course, the tenderloin of Carry Me Home. When the governor attended a test firing of the rocket in Huntsville 3 months after his state troopers spectacularly bloodied these civil rights marchers on Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Von Braun and the NASA chief visiting from Washington had asked Wallace during a casual conversation after the test firing if he would like to be the first man on the moon. And the governor, who was not without a certain raggedy wit, responded, well, you fellows might not bring me back. And I should mention one more attraction of the story. Michael was kind enough to not to mention that Carry Me Home took me 19 years to write. And when people now ask me if this book is going to take us long, I can say, I don't know, but I do have an excuse. It is rocket science. Now, Huntsville, I quickly learned, has a great deal of pride about its record on civil rights. When I started doing interviews up there, people would frequently remind me that Huntsville was not Birmingham. And one person even said to me that Huntsville's not Birmingham or Mobile. And I said, Mobile? What did Mobile do? And they said, oh, you know, the bridge? And I went, no, that was Selma. So that's sort of how clueless they were about civil rights history. But I came to realize that Birmingham and Selma, and let's face it, Anniston and Tuscaloosa, are not the only cities in Alabama with so-called image problems. For Huntsville, it turned out, has its own verboten N-word, and that word is Nazi. If anybody is so municipally incorrect as to bring up the subject of the Von Braun team's origins, the reply that you'll get is invariably, well, they were apolitical, that they were just pure scientists doing a job. Now, true, during the 1960s, when Huntsville's German Americans were distinguishing themselves as heroes of the Cold War, there wasn't a great deal of Holocaust consciousness back then. And I'm still sort of trying to figure out why this changed in the 80s. But at any rate, the U.S. Justice Department began to zero in on, as part of its sort of Nazi hunting arm, the Office of Special Investigations, started zeroing in on one of Von Braun's top managers who had worked with him back at Peenemünde. And his name was Arthur Rudolph. Here is Von Braun. Here's Arthur Rudolph. He was in charge. He was a program manager, so he was kind of in charge of all the moving parts of this vast research and development project. There was a room in his office called the Program Control Center that had 3,000 square feet of visual aids coordinating all the contractors with the research team in Huntsville. And it was really legendary in NASA. It was kind of a must-stop on every VIP tour of the Arsenal in Huntsville. And Rudolph had been one of Von Braun's main deputies since 1934. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1931, which was 2 years before Hitler became chancellor. So I learned in doing my research that it's sort of significant. It means that they were true believers if they joined up before Hitler took over in 1933. And beginning in 1943, Rudolph was placed in charge of this underground production factory for the V-2 that was carved out of a mountain in the Harz region. You saw that earlier in the picture of the V-2. And the workers in that factory were supplied by a concentration camp called Dora, which most of you have never heard of, even though it became one of the largest in the concentration camp system in Germany and had the highest death rate. Let me see. Here's a picture of the inmates making the V-2 in that underground tunnel. Now, the making of the V-2 specifically resulted in the death of at least 10,000 slave laborers, which was more than twice the number killed when the missiles rained down on London and Antwerp at the end of the war. And von Braun's biographer dryly called the V-2 a unique weapon. More people died producing it than died from being hit by it. Now, this is a propaganda photograph, by the way. This was something that Hitler's armaments minister had done to sort of promote it. So these conditions are good, relatively. There are two reasons for Dora's relative obscurity. Everybody in Russia has heard of it because they had a lot of Soviet inmates. But initially, there were no Jews there per se. So it doesn't, and I can explain that later a little bit if you're interested in question and answer. But so it really doesn't quite fit into the classic Holocaust narrative. And two, Dora ended up in East German territory. Its connection in East Germany to von Braun was generally pretty well known. Indeed, an agent for the East German state security, the Stasi, wrote a book about Huntsville about Dora and its connection to von Braun called Geheimnis von Huntsville, which means Secrets from Huntsville. But it never got any traction in the West because it could be easily dismissed as propaganda of the Cold War. Now, at any rate, in the waning days of the Cold War, when the Justice Department tracked down Arthur Rudolph in California, where he had retired, Rudolph did admit that in his capacity as the production manager of this plant, of this underground factory, he had witnessed at least one of the mass hangings that took place against suspected saboteurs. Now, work in the factory during these hangings would be halted so that the inmates would all have to file by the bodies, which were hung from, their mouths were gagged so that they couldn't curse the executioners, and they were raised slowly on a rope from a hook of a huge crane that they used in the building of the V-2 and gradually strangled to death. Rudolph left the country in 1984 under threat of prosecution for war crimes, and though he enlisted some congressional support to return to the country, he was ultimately rebuffed and died in Hamburg in 1996. Now, why am I telling you all this instead of what a fabulous subject, and I would say indeed great man, Wernher von Braun is? Surely he's the only engineer in history who could be compared to a rock star. To those of us growing up in Alabama during the 1960s, he was the Elvis of the geek sphere, though he was also wholesome enough to be sponsored on primetime television by Walt Disney, and that was even before Sputnik, that he was on, that he was put on television by Disney to sort of sell the space age. This was our answer, the U.S.'s answer to Sputnik, the Explorer satellite. This was the rocket, and that's von Braun with the other two people he worked on, that we put up 3 months after Sputnik. Sputnik was 1957. This was 58. And unique among the technocrats at NASA, von Braun really was able to match the movie star razzle-dazzle of John F. Kennedy, the president who in 1961 charged him to get us to the moon before this decade is out. And I'm reading his correspondence right now in the archives in Huntsville, von Braun's, and it took more than 4 full-time employees to answer all of it, which makes me vividly appreciate one of his most famous quotations, which is, one of our 2 greatest problems are gravity. He goes,